Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, into a world divided by color. The United States was still deeply segregated, a place where signs marked who could sit where, drink where, and live where. Yet inside the modest but warm home on Auburn Avenue, young Martin was surrounded by faith, discipline, and love. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a passionate Baptist preacher and a man of strong moral conviction. His mother, Alberta Williams King, was a gentle but firm teacher who instilled in him the values of education, compassion, and faith. The family lived near Ebenezer Baptist Church, where both his father and grandfather preached. From the pulpit, Martin absorbed the rhythm of sermons that blended justice, hope, and courage. But beyond the church walls, the reality of racial segregation quickly shaped his awareness. As a child, he was deeply hurt when a white friend's parents forbade their son from playing with him because of his skin color. That early pain stayed with him forever, planting the seed of his lifelong quest for equality. Despite the barriers around him, young Martin showed brilliance and maturity beyond his years. He skipped grades in school and entered Morehouse College at just 15. His childhood was both an awakening and a preparation, a mix of love at home and injustice outside, forming the foundation of the man who would one day dream of freedom for all. From his earliest years, Martin Luther King Jr. lived in the shadow of the church, not as a burden, but as a calling. The pulpit was the heart of his home, and the sound of sermons filled his childhood like music. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a fiery preacher who spoke with authority against injustice and demanded dignity from all men. Young Martin watched as his father refused to bow to racial humiliation, even confronting segregation face to face, once walking out of a store that insulted him. Those moments left deep marks on Martin's soul. At Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, the young boy absorbed the rhythm of worship, the power of words, and the strength of faith. His Sundays were filled with hymns, sermons, and the sight of his father's unwavering courage. Yet while his father's preaching was bold and thunderous, Martin's path would take on a quieter, more intellectual form, rooted in compassion, logic, and a burning belief in truth. By the time he entered Morehouse College, Martin had begun to question whether he should follow his father into ministry. He once doubted religion itself, calling it emotional and unscientific. But under the mentorship of Dr. Benjamin Mays, the college president and a moral giant in his own right, Martin came to see that faith could be a force for social change, a living, breathing tool for justice. That realization transformed his life. He decided to embrace the calling, not just to preach, but to lead, to heal, to awaken a conscience long asleep in America. The church was no longer just his family's legacy. It became his weapon of peace.
Martin Luther King Jr.'s journey of education was not just about earning degrees. It was the slow forging of a mind destined to reshape the moral landscape of the world. At Morehouse College, young Martin was surrounded by teachers who urged him to think critically about the world's injustices. It was here that he began to question not only the social order, but also the meaning of moral responsibility. Guided by Dr. Benjamin Mays, who taught that religion must serve humanity, Martin began to see that faith and reason were not enemies, they were allies in the pursuit of truth. After graduating from Morehouse in 1948, King went north to Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. There, he stood out as a serious, disciplined thinker, not only respected for his intellect, but also admired for his humility. At Crozer, he discovered the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, whose philosophy of nonviolent resistance would later become the backbone of his movement. He also studied the works of Plato, Hegel, and Reinhold Niebuhr, exploring the tension between idealism and realism, between love and power. By the time he entered Boston University for his PhD studies, King's worldview was crystallizing. He was captivated by the idea that the universe bends toward justice, and that human beings have both the power and duty to guide it there. In Boston, he met Coretta Scott, who would become his partner in life and in the struggle for equality. Those years were not just academic, they were formative. In lecture halls and libraries, he learned that great change begins with great thought. He was preparing his voice, sharpening it not for sermons alone, but for the speeches that would move nations.
When Martin met Coretta Scott, he wasn't yet a symbol. He was a young preacher with big dreams and a calm fire in his eyes. Coretta was more than a match for him, a gifted musician, educated, confident, and deeply committed to justice. They met while Martin was studying in Boston, and what began as a quiet courtship soon grew into a partnership that would help reshape history. Their marriage in 1953 was built on shared purpose. Coretta was not just the wife of a preacher, she was a partner in the mission, standing beside Martin through every threat, every march, and every moment of uncertainty. While Martin became the public voice of the civil rights movement, Coretta worked tirelessly behind the scenes, organizing events, raising their 4 children, and speaking out when her husband could not. Their home life was not easy. Constant death threats, long absences, and the burden of leadership weighed heavily. Yet Coretta's strength became Martin's refuge. When exhaustion, doubt, or fear crept in, she reminded him of the higher calling, that their struggle was not for fame, but for freedom. In private, Martin was a loving father, playful, patient, and deeply protective of his children. But history rarely allowed him to rest. Still, Coretta understood that his time, their sacrifice, was part of something greater. After his assassination, Coretta carried his legacy forward, proving that her courage equaled his. She became the keeper of his dream, ensuring that the light they built together would never fade. It began with a single act of quiet defiance. December 1st, 1955, Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a segregated bus. Her arrest lit a spark that would ignite the soul of a nation. When the news spread, a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr., just 26 years old, was chosen to lead the protest. He had not yet become the voice of a generation, but in those tense days, his courage and conviction began to define him. The Montgomery Bus Boycott lasted for 381 days. Black citizens refused to ride the buses, walking miles to work, organizing carpools, and enduring arrests, intimidation, and violence. White extremists bombed King's home, his wife and baby inside, yet he urged his followers not to fight back. Standing before a frightened crowd, he said, "We must meet hate with love." That message became his weapon, nonviolence rooted in faith and moral strength. The boycott crippled the city's bus system and drew national attention. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. But the victory was more than legal. It was spiritual. The world had seen what could happen when ordinary people stood together in peace and refused to surrender their dignity. For Martin Luther King Jr., Montgomery was not the end. It was the beginning, the moment he discovered the power of unity, the power of love, and the power of an idea that could move an entire nation. After the victory in Montgomery, Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a new kind of leader, not one who sought power, but one who sought justice through peace. His calm courage and moral clarity gave voice to millions who had long been silenced. He traveled across America, speaking in churches, community halls, and crowded streets, preaching a message that was both revolutionary and deeply human. Nonviolence is not passive. It is a powerful and active force for justice. Inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy, King shaped his own doctrine of nonviolent resistance, a blend of faith, strategy, and compassion. He believed that hatred could never drive out hatred, only love could do that. His speeches were not just words, they were calls to conscience. His marches were not just protests, they were acts of faith. Each step taken without violence was a challenge to a nation's soul. As he led demonstrations and organized communities, people saw in him not just a leader, but a symbol, a man willing to suffer for truth, yet never abandon hope. The movement was growing, and so was its power, but so were the dangers. Arrests, threats, and violence became a constant reality. Still, King stood firm, his voice steady, his spirit unbroken. From Montgomery streets to the heart of America, Martin Luther King Jr. had become more than a preacher. He was now the moral compass of a generation, guiding the nation toward justice through peace.
In 1957, following the success of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, Martin Luther King Jr. and other ministers founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, an organization that would turn the spirit of protest into a nationwide movement for change. The SCLC was built on a simple but powerful idea that faith, unity, and nonviolence could transform a nation divided by hate. Churches became centers of resistance, not with weapons, but with courage, prayer, and song. King, as its president, became the movement's guiding force. He believed that the church had a moral duty to lead America toward justice, saying, "The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but the conscience of the state." Under his leadership, the SCLC trained activists, coordinated marches, and inspired communities across the South to rise up, peacefully but powerfully. From small towns to major cities, ordinary people found their voices and joined the call for equality. The organization faced relentless opposition, bombings, arrests, and violence. Yet every act of hatred only strengthened their resolve. Each march, each sermon, each sit-in became a step to a freer America. Through the SCLC, King helped turn the dream of civil rights into a strategic, disciplined movement, one that captured the conscience of the world.
At the heart of Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement was a philosophy that transformed protest into moral power: nonviolence. King believed that love was not weakness, but the most powerful weapon for justice. His inspiration came from two sources: the teachings of Jesus Christ and the example of Mahatma Gandhi, who had shown that peaceful resistance could defeat even the mightiest empire. King studied Gandhi's methods deeply, understanding that true change could not come through hatred or revenge. He once said, "Nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon which cuts without wounding and ennobles the man who wields it." For King, nonviolence was not just a strategy, it was a way of life. It meant loving one's enemies, refusing to retaliate, and believing that through suffering and patience, truth would triumph. He taught his followers to face police brutality, humiliation, and jail without striking back. Every blow absorbed without retaliation revealed the injustice of the system and every act of forgiveness exposed the moral strength of the oppressed. Nonviolence turned marches into sermons, protests into prayers, and pain into purpose. It was both a spiritual discipline and a political force capable of moving the conscience of a nation.
In 1961, the fight for civil rights took to the highways of the American South with the Freedom Rides, a bold challenge to segregation in public transportation. Though Martin Luther King Jr. did not personally ride the buses, he strongly supported the movement and its young activists. Inspired by his teachings of nonviolent resistance, interracial groups of riders boarded buses to test Supreme Court rulings that had declared segregation in interstate travel unconstitutional. As the buses rolled into Alabama and Mississippi, they were met with mob violence, arrests, and burning buses. Yet the riders refused to strike back. They met hatred with courage and calm. King watched closely, offering moral and strategic guidance. He saw in the Freedom Riders the living proof that nonviolence could expose injustice and awaken national conscience. Their bravery forced the federal government to act, leading to the end of segregation in interstate travel. The Freedom Rides became a turning point, a message to the world that young Americans were willing to risk their lives for the promise of equality.
In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference launched the Birmingham Campaign, targeting one of the most segregated cities in America. Birmingham, Alabama, was ruled by racist laws and violent authorities, including the infamous police commissioner, Bull Connor. King knew that if they could expose the cruelty of segregation there, the whole nation would be forced to confront the truth. The movement began with peaceful marches, sit-ins, and boycotts, acts of nonviolent defiance. But the response was brutal. Protesters, including children, were beaten, jailed, and attacked with fire hoses and police dogs. From his jail cell, King wrote one of his most powerful works, The Letter from Birmingham Jail, defending civil disobedience as a moral duty against unjust laws. Images of the violence shocked the world, turning public opinion toward the civil rights movement. Despite fear and suffering, the protesters stood firm. Their courage broke the back of segregation in Birmingham and led to major victories for civil rights across the South.
From the cold, narrow walls of his Birmingham jail cell in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote one of the most profound and powerful documents in American history, The Letter from Birmingham Jail. Arrested for leading peaceful protests, King used scraps of paper and newspaper margins to craft his response to white clergymen who called his actions untimely and extreme. In his letter, King revealed the moral urgency of the civil rights struggle, writing, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." He argued that waiting for a better time meant never achieving justice at all. He exposed the hypocrisy of those who favored order over righteousness and challenged moderates who stood silent while others suffered. His words pierced the nation's conscience, demanding empathy, courage, and action. The letter became a moral blueprint for nonviolent resistance, studied across the world as a timeless call for justice.
On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, one of the largest demonstrations for human rights in American history. At the heart of that moment stood Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., ready to deliver a message that would echo through eternity. With the Lincoln Memorial behind him and the nation before him, King's words soared. "I have a dream." He spoke of a future where children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. His voice carried the hopes of millions, the dream of equality, freedom, and unity. The speech was not just poetry, it was prophecy, calling America to live up to its founding ideals. His dream became a moral compass for generations, inspiring movements for justice far beyond America's borders. Even today, his words remain a beacon of light, a reminder that peace and equality are not distant dreams, but duties we must fulfill.
After years of marches, protests, and powerful speeches, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. witnessed a historic breakthrough, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was the culmination of tireless struggle, moral courage, and unshakable faith in justice. This landmark law outlawed segregation in schools, workplaces, and public spaces, a direct strike against the system of racial discrimination that had defined America for centuries. But this victory did not come easily. King and countless activists endured arrests, violence, and threats, yet they never abandoned the path of nonviolence. Their determination forced the nation to confront its conscience. When President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the act into law, it was not just a political triumph, it was a moral awakening. For King, this was proof that peaceful resistance could reshape history. The Civil Rights Act became a turning point in America's journey toward equality, a victory born not of hatred, but of love, persistence, and unyielding faith.
In 1964, at just 35 years old, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. received the Nobel Peace Prize, becoming the youngest recipient in history at that time. The world honored him not for military power or political dominance, but for his moral strength, his message of love, and his unwavering commitment to nonviolence. Standing in Oslo, King humbly accepted the award on behalf of the movement, not himself. He declared that the prize was a profound recognition that nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral question of our time. To him, the honor was not a symbol of completion, but of responsibility, a reminder that the struggle for freedom was far from over. He donated the entire $54,000 prize to the civil rights cause, turning personal recognition into collective progress. The Nobel Peace Prize cemented Martin Luther King Jr. as a global symbol of hope, proving that courage, faith, and peace could challenge even the deepest injustice. In 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. turned his focus to Selma, Alabama, a place where Black citizens were systematically denied the right to vote. Alongside the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, and local activists, King led a campaign that would shake the conscience of America. Peaceful marchers set out from Selma to Montgomery, demanding one simple right, the right to vote. But on March 7, 1965, known as Bloody Sunday, state troopers brutally attacked them on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The shocking images of men and women beaten for demanding justice horrified the nation. King responded not with anger, but with courage and faith. He called for nonviolent perseverance, returning days later with thousands of supporters, clergy, students, and ordinary citizens to march again. Their persistence paid off. Later that year, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the most significant victories of the civil rights movement. Selma showed the world that moral power could overcome physical violence, and that King's dream was not just about equality, it was about the right to shape one's own destiny.
By the mid-1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. was no longer just the nation's moral voice. He was also one of its most controversial figures. His calls for justice, equality, and peace made him a hero to millions, but also a target for critics from every direction. Many white Americans, even those who once admired him, turned away as King began speaking out not only against racism, but also poverty and the Vietnam War. He argued that a nation spending billions to destroy life abroad while neglecting its poor at home had lost its moral compass. This stance cost him dearly. Politicians condemned him, newspapers labeled him unpatriotic, and even some civil rights leaders thought he was going too far. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, intensified its surveillance and harassment, trying to discredit him. Yet King refused to be silent. He said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." Through every attack, he stood firm in his belief that justice must be universal, that to fight for equality in one area while ignoring suffering in another was to betray the very spirit of humanity.
By the late 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. had begun to see that racial equality alone was not enough. He turned his attention to two deeper evils tearing at the fabric of America: poverty and war. King launched the Poor People's Campaign, a movement to unite Americans of all races in demanding economic justice. He believed that true freedom meant more than civil rights. It meant the right to work, live with dignity, and have access to opportunity. He said, "What good is having the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger?" At the same time, King courageously spoke out against the Vietnam War. He condemned the violence abroad and at home, declaring that America had become the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. His anti-war stance shocked the political establishment and alienated some former allies. But for King, morality was indivisible. He could not condemn violence in Birmingham while ignoring bombs in Vietnam. His message was clear: justice anywhere is linked to justice everywhere. This new phase of his activism revealed the depth of his vision, not just for Black Americans, but for all humanity.
As the civil rights movement evolved, Martin Luther King Jr. realized that the struggle for justice was larger than race alone. It was about economic inequality and the oppression of all poor people, regardless of color. In 1968, he launched the Poor People's Campaign, a bold effort to unite Black, white, Latino, and Native American communities in demanding jobs, fair wages, housing, and dignity. King envisioned a multiracial movement that would march on Washington, not for rights alone, but for real opportunity. He spoke passionately about the moral failure of a wealthy nation that allowed millions to live in poverty. "We must recognize," he said, "that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together." Through this campaign, King sought to expand his dream from racial equality to human equality, from civil rights to economic rights. It was his most ambitious mission, one that challenged the very structure of American society.
In April 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, to support the sanitation workers' strike, a protest for dignity, fair pay, and equality. The workers, mostly Black men, carried signs that read, "I am a man." King saw their fight as part of the broader struggle for human rights and economic justice. Despite exhaustion and threats to his life, King continued to speak with courage and faith. On the night of April 3, 1968,
he delivered his final prophetic speech. "I've been to the mountaintop." With haunting calm, he told the crowd, "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." The next evening, on April 4, 1968, while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. The news sent shockwaves across America and the world. He was just 39 years old. His death ignited riots, grief, and mourning, but also renewed commitment to his message of peace and justice. King became not only a leader, but a martyr, a man who gave his life for the dream of equality, compassion, and human dignity.
The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. did not end his movement. It transformed it into a timeless moral force that continues to shape the world. His legacy became a cornerstone of the global struggle for justice, equality, and peace. In the years after his death, King's vision inspired new generations to confront racism, poverty, and violence through nonviolent resistance. His leadership laid the foundation for the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, which changed the face of American democracy. But beyond laws, his dream reshaped the nation's conscience, teaching that love is stronger than hate, and that peace can triumph through courage. Around the world, leaders such as Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, and countless activists drew strength from King's example. His message crossed borders, religions, and generations. Today, his life is honored with a national holiday in the United States, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, celebrated every January. In Washington, D.C., the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial stands tall beside the tidal basin, inscribed with his words, "Out of the mountain of despair, a stone of hope." King's dream continues to echo in classrooms, protests, parliaments, and hearts around the world. A living reminder that the fight for justice never ends, and that every person carries the power to help bend the arc of history toward righteousness.
Martin Luther King Jr. was not only a leader of movements, he was a master of moral language, turning pain into poetry and conviction into timeless truth. His words remain alive today, echoing through classrooms, protests, and the hearts of those who still believe in justice and peace. On love, he taught that compassion is the greatest weapon against hatred. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. On justice, he spoke with prophetic clarity, reminding the world that silence and neutrality in the face of evil are themselves injustices. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The time is always right to do what is right. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. On courage, King revealed that true bravery is not found in violence or power, but in standing firm for what is right, even when alone. Faith is taking the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. On peace and nonviolence, he called for a revolution of spirit. Nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon which cuts without wounding and ennobles the man who wields it. We must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. And on the dream that defined his life and death, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." King's words still called to the human conscience, urging every generation to walk the hard road of justice with love as their guide, courage as their companion, and peace as their destination.